Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Yeah, it's good. Welcome to this latest session in the Trade Union and Working Class History Series, run in partnership by the General Federation of Trade Unions Educational Trust, the Marx Memorial Library, and the Working Class Movement Library. My name is Matt Dunn, and I'm the archivist here at the Marx Memorial Library, which is the leading research and education centre on Marxism and socialist history, and it's been at the heart of the British labour movement for over 90 years. The library is home to a unique collection of published and archival sources spanning the whole range of the labour movement, including trade unionism, peace and solidarity movements, and the Spanish Civil War. You can see some of the Spanish Civil War material at the back of this room as well. Just a couple of housekeeping points. Toilets, we have a gender-neutral toilet just outside this door over here, and then we have one halfway up, a ladies' toilet halfway up the stairs as well. We're not expecting a fire drill this evening, so if the fire alarm does go, there is a fire escape to the back of the room, and there's also one just out the front door, so the way you came in. Our assembly point is outside on Clerkenwell Green, just in front of the Crown Pub. So how tonight's event is going to work. The event is hybrid, and people are joining us on Zoom, in our Zoom webinar, and also live here in the library. For those people joining online, this is a webinar, which means you can see us, but you cannot see each other. Feel free to use the chat function throughout the call, but to ask any questions, which we'll have at the end of the session, please use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of the screen. I'll then select questions. I'll select a mix of people in the room and then people on Zoom as well, and ask, well, either me and directly. For those people in the room, when we get to questions, I'd like you to just raise your hand to indicate that you'd like to make a comment, and then I'll make my way to you. Tonight is the 9th session in this year's programme, and it's on the topic of the Wapping dispute and Printworker organisation with myself and Theo. We'll have a maximum of 45 minutes presentation, so I'll be speaking for roughly 10 minutes or so, and then we'll be speaking for about half an hour. And then it'll be followed with a chance for questions for 45 minutes. So we're aiming to finish at 8:30. Before I hand over to Anne, I'd just like to explain a bit about my role in the library and what we've been doing around print workers, trade unions, and the Wapping dispute in particular. So first of all, for anyone totally new to this area, the Wapping dispute was a year-long dispute in 1986 and 1987 between the workers at the Sun, the Times, and the News of the World, and the owner of those papers, Rupert Murdoch, and his company, News International. Murdoch developed a new plant based in Wapping to move production from Fleet Street, where print trade unions were particularly strong. When the plant was complete, Murdoch attempted to force workers to accept new, reduced conditions there. This was rejected by the workers. Unions balloted to strike. When the strike was announced, Murdoch immediately sacked close to 6,000 workers who were employed at the papers. It is worth remembering that this was just a year after the miners' strike, and similarly, this represents a trend in the 80s to attack trade unions and challenge working class organisation by business owners and the state, made possible by Thatcher's legislation, anti-union legislation. Again, similar to the miners' strike, unions faced legal challenges to disrupt their action, and picketing workers faced extreme police violence. I'll leave Anne to go into details about the significance of this and explain more about the development of workers organising in the print industry leading up to Wapping. But first, I'll talk briefly about my work on our Wapping collection, our Printworkers collection. So I am about a year and a half into a 2-year project to catalogue the Printworkers collection that's held here in the library. It was deposited in the library in 2012 by Unite, which various print workers have merged into over time. Since then, it's been supplemented with other collections, including personal collections of people involved and some from particular campaign groups as well. The print collection contains materials from workers organising in the print industry since the 19th century. Workers organising in the industry does go back further than that, though it's worth noting. A lot of the material is from London and Fleet Street in particular, but the collection does go beyond that to include material from around the country and in a wide variety of printing and publishing workplaces. It includes material from trade unions themselves, particular campaigns, as well as collections from individuals reflecting their own activity within unions. And it has material on key disputes in the print industry, especially in the second half of the 20th century, including a lockout at the Times in the late 70s and an occupation and working by workers at Bryant Colour Printing in South London. But a large part of the collection is on Wapping, and this is in the News International Dispute Archive, or NIDA. NIDA was set up by workers and activists who have been involved in the disputes to mark its 25th anniversary. They initially created an exhibition which toured around the country, and as it did, they received donations of contemporary material created during the dispute. This was added to material created and collected by members of the NIDA collective itself during their involvement in the dispute, and so eventually that became the archive, and it was represented here. The collection is extremely rich in information and contains some stunning material documenting the many different parts of the dispute, from workers, trade unions and their supporters, and actually some from the company as well. Most of the contents is extremely rare, and it does contain a great deal of unique material. In particular, we can think of handwritten material, sometimes notes, sketches, things like that. It contains publications, some of the many publications created by the workers involved. They were, of course, print workers. They were working on newspapers and used to creating this kind of thing. And most notably amongst that is the Wapping Post. And I've got a copy of the Wapping Post actually out on display if anyone would like to have a look at our display of material after this talk. The collection also includes a range of photos, banners, leaflets, lots of other material, and organising papers. And these are organising everything to do with the disputes, from negotiation documents, ballots, picket rotors, fundraising documents, draft songs and chants used on demonstrations and picket lines. I'm very pleased to say that the catalogue for NIDA is now complete, and it can be searched on our online catalogue. As well as this, we have a subject guide. So this is on our website, and it explains a bit more about the story of the dispute, and it highlights key parts of the collection, and as well as some relevant items such as newspapers from elsewhere in the library's collection, elsewhere in the print collection. Research has already been ongoing on this collection while we've been cataloguing it. I'm very pleased to say that soon we'll be working in partnership with Brunel University on a PhD project which will be using this collection to look at the Wapping Post. We're also looking forward next year to mark 40th anniversary with a symposium held here in the library. And of course, we are very excited to be able to use this extremely valuable collection in our education programme and to make it available to any researchers in the library. So this is now going to be available to anyone to use for their research from anything that they want to look into about it. So that's it from me. I will pass over, apologies. I'll pass over to Anne. Anne was a national officer of Unite and GPMU and represented prints and publishing workers from 1974 until 2009. She is a joint creator of the Wapping exhibition and archive at the Marx Memorial Library.
Okay, thank you. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk to everybody about Wapping, but today, what led up to Wapping and why. The actual commemorations and great detail of what happened during the dispute on the day that the dispute was declared, and then what happened during the whole of that year up until February 1987 and beyond, will be commemorated next year, starting on the 24th of January 2026, which will be the exact date of the 40th anniversary. So today we're looking at the long road to Wapping, and it's entirely appropriate that we've got here a copy of a cartoon done by Tony Hall. So some of you may already be aware of Tony Hall cartoons. He was a cartoonist to the movement, to the labour movement, for a number of decades. But he was also one of the workers sacked by Murdoch in 1986, along with his colleagues in the graphics department. And this is a very famous cartoon of his. And it's entirely appropriate because, of course, the 80s was the decade where appropriation of workers' jobs, livelihoods and communities very much became the order of the day, and since, whereas inherited property, inherited capital, of course, is sacrosanct. But actions since then have shown that there's no such reverence attached to the working class and working class communities. 200 years of struggle across all industries, sections and communities for jobs, better conditions and justice was put into reverse by the actions of the Tory government, and still in operation today, as we all know. But the consequence has been to discourage and prevent action in defence of workers, but also significantly solidarity action was forbidden and is still forbidden, and has specifically discouraged and undermined, almost to the point of illegality, actions of solidarity elsewhere, not just at the place of work. Witness the actions of the law, the police and so on in relation to the environment activists, Just Stop Oil and so on, and very specifically Palestine solidarity. So in picture 2, we've just got briefly the print union badges, just to remind everyone. I know there's some badge people here. This is only a selection of the many scores of print union badges that have been produced over the centuries. But the decade or so from the late 70s through to the end of the 80s saw the systematic dismantling of workplace and trade union rights. And the 1986 Wapping dispute has often been described as the watershed moment in print, and indeed it was. A quick description of the history of print workers' struggle for rights and recognition will no doubt illustrate why the ruling class decided that at all costs they had to stop the growing strength of workers in print and elsewhere. So print and other workers began their struggles hundreds of years ago in defence of jobs and communities. But of course, in the earlier days, defiant workers were transported or jailed, and in some instances, picture 3, were sentenced to death and had their sentences commuted. This is an example of the list of 29 paper makers in 1831. I won't mention that it predates Toll Huddle because it'll upset me to people in but people in all trades and industries were being transported, some sentenced to death, and then having their sentences commuted. And paper makers were involved in the swing riots because it was a rural industry at the time, and they were very much in combat alongside their comrades in agricultural workers. The first recorded strikes of bookbinders, compositors, printers, and papermakers all took place in the 1780s and 90s. There are virtually no records before that, and some were jailed. The demands were for shorter hours, working hours were horrendous, 80 and 90 hours a week, and the conditions were appalling. And this area, of course, is very much part and parcel of the tradition of the printing and publishing industry. And the courthouse here, this big building, which was the Sessions House, which is 40 years younger than this building, the Marx Memorial Library, is where the bookbinders in 1786 were charged with conspiracy over their claim for shorter hours. 24 of them were charged. 6 were imprisoned. 1 died in prison. Printers in those days called pressmen in 1798 were jailed for conspiracy to limit the number of apprentices, i.e. low-paid child labour, youth labour, to undercut the journeyman printers. 19 comps and pressmen or printers were prosecuted and jailed in 1810 for combining and conspiring to improve conditions at the Times. By the way, Times is a repeated theme here, simply for historical accuracy. In 1814, believe it or not, the Times at the time installed steam presses in secret down the road at Printing House Square. It was used to be opposite Blackpool Station, so they really seriously got form, even though it's not the same company. The 29 paper makers were transported in 1831, and the 230-year-old statute, which applied across all trades, stipulating the number of apprentices and standards and terms and conditions, was repealed in 1814 because it had fallen into disuse. But the culture, which had applied for all those decades and decades of standard terms, was maintained by the workers, especially in print, who formed lodges and printing societies, especially during the periods of repression, such as the Combination Acts. But despite that legal repression and attacks by the employers, terms and conditions of employment for pay and hours began to emerge during the early 19th century. So the next picture, I think, is, where are we? The first recorded agreement in papermaking was something called the Rochester Resolution. Papermakers started to adopt, and that was made in 1804. The first scale of prices, which was one of the parts of Fleet Street legend that was so vilified by the employers, was actually started by the employers in 1785. But it wasn't until 1847 that it was discussed and agreed for the first time with the union. But it has long historical links with its predecessors. These scales, this is all leading up to the embedding, if you like, of a very long-standing culture of workers being part and parcel of determining their terms and conditions of employment in discussion and sometimes in combat with their employers. The scales, the scale of prices, was accepted within the trade as the norm. Employers that did not observe them were deemed to be unfair, and union members were encouraged or instructed not to seek employment with them. So you can see immediately, not only is it the terms and conditions question, it's also the closed shop question. Print companies were struck off the fair list if they failed to comply with these terms. The Times, again, and Spottiswood's, which was the parliamentary printer at the time, were struck off for nearly 100 years by the union for refusing to comply. Next picture, I think. This is the bookbinders. Next one after that. Yeah. The craft print unions, as they were formed during the 1800s, included rule book provision for rates of pay. Eventually, they had to give this up because what they were saying to people is, you've got to get the rate of pay before you can come into the union. Now, that was so embedded in tradition that even as late as 1990, there were a couple of branches in the NGO, but also SOGAT, that were still trying to apply that. But the unions actually stopped generally trying to apply that in the latter part of the 19th century. You can imagine saying to people, oh, you can't join the union until you've got the rate of pay. Why would you join the union? In order to get them. But anyway, there you go. But that rule book provision, i.e. the rates of pay, was certainly a hangover from the custom of pay, hours and apprentices regulations, which had existed for more than 2 centuries. In other words, you can't just do away with something when people have, it's part and parcel of people's lives. And this shock wave that has repeated and repeated and repeated in the last 40 years, you can exactly see how it's undermined and destroyed working class confidence. The requirement of all print workers within a company to be in a trade union grew from these same customs in order to protect workers from unfair practices and pay reduction. And by the way, throughout the entire 19th century, there were as many disputes and strikes to prevent or try to prevent wage reduction as there were strikes and mobilization to improve condition. This picture, it's a bit sort of dark, but it's the Jubilee souvenir front cover of the London Society of Compositors. The union was formed originally in the late 1700s, but they reformed in 1848, a significant year. But in this booklet, which is here in the library, it's a very interesting survey and description of people trying to do their best to organize the union and hold on to their conditions. In 1839, there were 2 lots of unions in London, entirely separate, trying to do the same thing. The bookbinders doing their own thing on hours and recognition, and ditto the London Society of Compositors entirely. Now, if you read the union histories, you'll hardly read anything about the other unions. So it's really important that in this publication that Tony and I got together, it brings together for the first time the history of print workers in action, either together or separately, but often at the same time. And in 1839, for the first time, there was formal recognition of the bookbinders and also the London Commons. The strike that brought about the agreement for the bookbinders went on for 30 weeks. 30 weeks. And it resulted in a reduction in the number of apprentices that have been engaged to undercut adult pay, and the withdrawal of prosecutions because they were going to be prosecuted for conspiracy, which still applies today, by the way, in common law. The organisational discipline of rule book adherence, as well as the ability to be considered for work in the trade, underpinned print unions' strength in engagement with the employers. In other words, rule book adherence meant keeping the closed shop, insisting or demanding or campaigning with employers for pay and conditions uniformity as minimums, not necessarily as maximum. But of course, the masters, as they were still called then, which were the companies, didn't always cooperate. So the next 2 pictures are absolutely wonderful. Again, there's a theme here, which you'll see. Surprise, surprise, boycott the sun. 1852. The next one, that's the stonemasons, and then we should have another one of, not that one, previous one. We should have the stonemasons and the carpenters. We've not got 2 there. There we are. Carpenters and joiners and the stonemasons. And this was the Sun, or Sun newspaper, as it was in those days, absolutely nothing to do with the Daily Herald, and then subsequently became Sun, had decided that they weren't going to apply the minimum rates of pay. And so this leaflet, you can't see the text, but again, we've got this in the library. It's reproduced in a wonderful book by an old comp, now deceased, unfortunately, about the compositors in London. And it absolutely says, we don't want your money, we just want you to stop buying the Sun. So, we're still doing it. So it's really, I mean, these are sort of what would be called now, what they call the clusters of coincidence. But it's interesting how there's sort of the Times and the Sun. Anyway, there you go. So although national union organisation in print emerged much later during the 20th century, during the 19th century, workers were organised by print trade unions in regions. So you had the London Society of Bookbinders, the London Society of Compositors, and then in the provinces you had bunches of typographical associations that eventually came together, and the same thing for bookbinders. The most unruly groups of workers in terms of getting them together, like cats in a sack, the usual, were bookbinders and compositors, but eventually in the 20th century they were all brought together. Throughout the century as well, battles ensued over long working hours and unhealthy conditions. Scottish print workers had half average age of mortality. London bookbinders' average life expectancy was 47. So aside from horrific injury and death in the paper making, which is still one of the most dangerous industries in the UK, print workers were also, because of terrible hours and shocking conditions, not healthy. But as print and paper worker trade union membership expanded among non-craft workers, demand intensified for better working hours and conditions. Because the non-craft workers, men and women, their hours were even longer, their conditions were even worse, and their pay was rock bottom, the worst than in the box making industry. Demand intensified for better working hours and conditions, inspired by the 9-hour movement in other industries in the 1870s, and later the 8-hour movement. And during this time also, as we're getting towards the end of the 19th century, employer federations began to emerge alongside trade unions' own federation. And that led to the formation of what we now call these days sector agreements with the individual unions in general print and local newspapers and national newspapers. And if only that would be taken up now by our present government, I think a lot of difficulties will be, if not solved, at least alleviated. So in picture 8, there we go. This is again a book. All this material is available for view in the Printworkers collection here at the library. This is 1911, and it's a report of the conference of the delegation of unions, the Printing and Kindred Trades Federation of the United Kingdom, which is the group of all the print unions put together, talking to the employers in 1911 about working hours, pay as well, but essentially working hours. And the 8,000 print workers in London gathered together for a meeting as a consequence of the failure of this conference with the employers to bring about a reduction in and a 20-week dispute, a strike ensued, during which London Society of Compositors again produced a strike bulletin, which became the Daily Herald. Now, the awful thing about this, of course, is that eventually the Daily Herald became the Sun, bought by Murdoch in 1969, which that's another story. But the point was that although they didn't achieve the 48-hour working week straight away. After World War I, a landmark agreement was made between the general print employers and the P and K tier to establish the 48-hour week, and equally important for the provision of settlements of disputes by conciliation, and that was in 1919. So you can see the build-up of the pegs, if you like, of the foundation of strong, confident, assertive trade union organisation based on, it has to be said, an understanding by government and employers within the system. We're not talking socialism here, we're talking about giving workers at least half a crack at fairness and justice. After the protests and troubles during the First World War at shop floor level, where people were exploited and were expected to do more than their fair share, and there was a lot of discontent, and of course the Russian Revolution in 1917 frightened the life out of the British establishment. A report was produced by Whitley. Next one, please, number 9, which recommended that joint industrial councils be established in all industries. All industries. Now, in the 70s, I remember these were sort of, you thought, well, what do we want those for? We don't want them. So they fell away. Well, just read the first 3 lines there. If you can't see it, let me read it for you. A JIC of employer and trade union representatives was established for the printing and allied trades in 1919 with wide-ranging objectives to secure complete organisation of employers and employees throughout the trade, to cooperate in the maintenance of fair prices and wages, promote good relationships, establish uniform working hours, conditions, minimise unemployment. Now, if an employer offered that to us today, I think we'd say yes, immediately. This is 1919. But the point I'm making not is, oh God, if we have it now, but the point is that these sorts of principles and procedures are what underpinned negotiations through all of the disputes and pitfalls that occurred in the following 60 years. That was a major influence and a bit of a bedrock. Shortly afterwards, again in 1919, the following slide, number 10, a similar JIC was established for the paper-making industry with the union. And there's just a little extract there of the wages for adult males. There were women in there somewhere, but anyway, we've just put that in because this was the first time that all the rates of pay and the reduction in hours provided for all paper workers, not just craft paper makers. To continue the hours, we can't go into all the agreements about all the pay, just take too long. So I've concentrated on our working hours just to show you how it all builds up. The next slide, which is numbers 10, 11 and 12. Now it is absolutely lovely, this book. It's in the library, in the printer's collection. It's a photo album created in 1959 by a couple of people who were involved in this dispute. Now, this was 100,000 workers involved in strike and other forms of industrial action in pursuit of better pay, yes, but the 40-hour. They didn't get the 40-hour week straight away. It's a 6-week dispute. All the unions were involved, but in 1962, the 40-hour week came in. So again, mobilisation, absolutely strong. Everybody's on 40 hours, somewhere on less, we have to say, but we'll come to that in a minute. But it was the whole of general print. And of course, that then influenced all of the other sectors that weren't already on a 40-hour week. And that lovely picture, this one, picketing, 1959, picketing style. Loads of people at the factory gate, no police. Okay. Now the next slide, women print workers at the Bank of England, just to make the point that it wasn't only men in the industry. You saw some of the women who were involved at that place that was being picketed previously. Almost 50% of that workplace was women. But anyway, again, recognition being expanded all the time. And this is the Bank of England. The women workers, the examiners, the finishers and examiners, there were nearly 500 of them employed at the Bank of England printing works in Debden. Who knew? And they went on strike in 1978 for union recognition. 400 of them were in the union at the time, and then another 50 or 60 or so joined as a consequence of the dispute. And then a while later, they had another mobilization, should we call it, for better pay, to get equal pay with the minimum rates of the chaps. The management was so horrified at all these women having a meeting that an army helicopter was ordered to circle. There. By the middle of the century, most workers in the industry, most workers, probably 3/4, maybe higher than that, benefited from union organized collective agreements agreed with the employers. And for 60 years, it was acknowledged that working hours should be common to all, whereas pay and other matters had to be dealt with by independent of each union. Long battles took place over pay, conditions and opportunities for non-craft workers as well. We won't go into that now from first of all, but that's another story. But there were particular barriers for women. But I love this because this just shows what can be done when we get cracking. Another aspect of print union organisation is solidarity. And the confidence and strength of print workers, not just in national newspapers, but elsewhere. So let's have the next one, which is numbers 14 and 15. In 1926, workers at the Daily Mail and at the Evening News, I found out today, but certainly at the Daily Mail, refused to print an editorial which was a disgusting vilification of the miners. And as a consequence of that, the employers used the opportunity to say, well, blow you, no more negotiations, and the general strike was starting. Apparently, union members did the same at the Evening News the following night, which was absolutely great. So this is a solidarity in action, and that tradition had lasted a very long time. It's now illegal.
Have Arthur Scargill in a minute doing High Hill.
Yes, yeah, coming to that.
Oh, that's right.
That's all right.
Not High Hill, I mean High Hill.
Yeah, exactly. And then in 1972, the electricians, the Fleet Street press branch of the electricians, were the first out to, in protest of the dockers being imprisoned, and the whole of Fleet Street, with one or two exceptions. Solidarity. And then in 1982, the TUC Day of Action in support of the health workers and the NHS. Again, virtually the whole of Fleet Street was out. And by the way, that's the last time that there was any stoppage in Fleet Street other than Wapping. And the Upper Clyde shipbuilders in 1971, their occupation inspired many other sit-ins and occupations, including at Bryant Colour Printing in 1972. As trade union strength grew, you can see this one, Fleet Street strikes in support of NHS work is just a few articles there to prove that what I'm saying is actually happened. As trade union strength grew, workers in print became more confident to challenge vitriol and lies being printed about trade unionists and struggle. Notable examples of national newspaper workers using their strength about scurrilous reporting include the railway workers in 1919. Fleet Street workers protested and refused to print the editorial. Miners in 1926, and again, yes, in 1984. And Rundwick workers' refusal at the Observer and also the Daily Express to print rubbish, 1977. The next slide, the campaign for press and broadcasting freedom was issued in the 80s about the campaigns, the media owners' vicious and unremitting campaigns against the unions in support of the Tory government in 1979. Every measure calculated to undermine workers' conditions and protection. Everything about trade unions, those of you who are old enough to remember or were about at the time will remember that everything collective was wrong, everything trade union was disgusting and should be destroyed. Entire workforces were destroyed, collective agreements on pay, conditions, rights of representation, recognition, unilaterally ripped up, entire communities devastated. The two industries with workers perceived as the strongest and best organised were the mines and print. To crush both sets of trade unions was the entwined aims of Tory government, financiers, employers and the media. First anti-trade union law of the Tory government intended to outlaw the close shop, following the Leggett report in the late 70s, vilifying campaigns run by Slade and the NGO to ensure material was handled by the union. So in that context, the Wapping dispute exploded in January 1986, within 9 months of the end of the miners' strike and less than 2 years after the end of the Stockport Messenger. Murdoch's News International sacked an entire workforce of 5,500 workers within 20 minutes or so of the strike being declared. And one of the dismissal letters is on display, 24th of January out. In fact, the dismissal letters were waiting for people as they left. Egged on by other newspaper owners, right-wing journalists and influential academics, present company accepted, Murdoch's aim was to destroy the ability of the unions, the chaffles in particular, and to stop interference with the company's right to manage, challenging content, and so they could retain editorial and press freedom, and to stop unions taking action in support of other workers. The demands sought to abolish 9 decades of employer-agreed procedures and negotiations, the dissolution of trade union rights, organisation and customs, which have been present in the printing industry for 2 centuries. None of the workers were reinstated, and the print unions remain unrecognised by the company. And that slide there, this was the letter that was revealed after the strike had started to show that the company aim was to provoke a strike. It was a conspiracy. And the last slide. In the 1990s, a campaign was organised for press for union rights. And although print and paper workers at News International were never reinstated and the unions remain unrecognised, the fight goes on in the printing and publishing and papermaking industry. And GPMU IT section of Unite is as active as it ever was, trying to defend members and trying to advance their terms and conditions of employment. So there we are, open for questions, comments, disagreements, and I look forward to seeing you all again for the commemoration of the dispute in Jamestown.
Right, thank you very much, Anne.